Chapter 16, Reincarnation, July 14th, 0900 hours, General Mikhail Joseph Smith's office. Mikhail sat alone in his office, wearing full-dress BDUs, including the cap. Mikhail spoke into his personal data logger, his intent to define perspective and reasoning for his recent actions. He spoke candidly and clearly. I am Mikhail Joseph Smith, appointed General of the Earth Charter of Thematic Corps. As of making this recording, I have given orders that Earth's bases are to be dislodged from the planet, and we are currently on course for the planet of Tarathar. Taking this action officially creates Time Paradox 3076, which is also the appointed date of the apocalypse in terms of measuring time by the way that its currents have been altered. However, I have found in my studies of language that this word apocalypse does not mean destruction or ending, not precisely. For the people who wrote these directives, the events I'm telling you about are now but ancient history. The word apocalypse, in this case, means the same thing as awakening. In that way, an apocalypse is but an awakening to what is, and as such, would be an end to the way the world was known previously, the end of the old world. I still plan, and the articles leave provision for the possibility of determining what it is that has driven my planet mad. There are means by which I could send a small, highly specialized team to Earth rapidly, but no return route exists that is so easily accessible. But, until some defense is devised, even my own people are now vulnerable to the strange vibrations on the planet. For this reason, I plan to wait until more is known before I intervene in Earth's fate. This action should be a correction. I must re-emphasize that this action, though prescribed, could bear out unforeseen complications. However, I cannot in good conscience leave everyone to suffer at the hands of some unseen force. I personally believe that uncovering the who and the why of that situation will be of great importance to correcting other events. I can't precisely say why. It's a sort of instinct that I've learned to trust over time. If I never cause the apocalypse of 3076, the planet utterly destroys itself. The people destroy themselves, unaware of what they have been intoxicated by. If these events go according to plan, one way or another, Earth gets past this hurdle. All of its people will unite. That unity over time will become the beginnings of Matic technology. Though united, the humans of that timeline will live a life of conquest against other worlds, starting in the Earth year 2261. By the time Earth year 2637 comes around, they will have decimated the Targ over 80 long years of war. Rightfully fearing for their survival, the blue-skinned, fossil-fuel-drinking Targ will have stolen a time ship from Crutonians. That time technology will be used to plan a counter-insurgency across time. Their remaining forces go back to Earth year 2200 to destroy it all before it ever sets foot into their space. Humanity is then destroyed. The Purple Lady will start an Earth branch of Matic, which will take humans from Tarathar armed with Crutonian technology from the future. These humans will start Matic on Earth in the year 1620, secretly growing the Corps' strength. The presence and appearance of Matic will be the catalyst that changes events. They will advance and attack the Targ. The Targ will strike back. Humanity on Earth will be destroyed, and then the Earth chapter of Matic will be created. Earth is relocated to the future and becomes Tarathar. Humans are restarted on Tarathar in the future, where they have no access to other planets and are kept in check by the balance of power with a multiracial world, then are sent back to Earth to change its fate. If humanity were to destroy itself on its own, then the Matic core on Earth is never created. The Earth never creates Matic, and by the time it goes out into the galaxy, it finds itself completely unprepared for what awaits it. With assistance from Matic, that world is saved, and then becomes the Earth that starts this whole cycle. If there's one thing I've learned about the universe, it's that everything is cyclical. If anything, I can trust in that. For now, I think about a young girl who needs a funeral, and how to save my planet from an event it can't seem to avoid. When we arrive at Tarathar, I will consult the prominent Mages Guild on the largest continent. Perhaps they can offer some insight that I am missing. I know we need to leave Earth so that the events can unfold, but as this has been the trend for the entirety of the war across time and existence, events are still not unfolding as they should. As the leader of my chapter of Matic, it is my divine responsibility to find out why and fix it. Godspeed to us all. End recording. The computer made a blipping sound and then stated in a female voice, "Data log concluded." Mikhail spoke to the computer again. "Computer, encrypt, store in archives and apply clearance code Celestial." The computer made another trilling sound and announced, "File saved and classified." July 21st, 17:2700 hours. Quarters of Warrant Officer James Battalion. Today was James's 16th birthday, and with the total lack of Matic activities while traveling through space, he had been assigned the week off, but he wasn't thinking about any of that. Within the small office of his personal quarters, he had set up an elaborate system of wires and switches. The wires ran from various corners of the room in multiple directions. Each of the series of wires led to switches. The switches were connected to miniature models of cameras and doorways. In the midst of all the mess of wires and other hardware sat his laptop computer. The screen on the computer showed blueprints of the design of various corridors and of Ward 13 in particular. Upon assembling all the wires and testing all the connections, and having verified the function of each, James proceeded with a series of experiments. James had Matic action figures staged all over the setup, with some near the doors and others in front of the cameras. James turned on the cameras, hit a button on his keyboard that activated a door, then synchronized his watch to keep time with their system. Then, using his super speed time-bending powers, he would try to move one of the action figures by the cameras without them being spotted. He made several attempts to do so, but each time, one of the cameras would end up catching a few frames, showing an action figure or his hand touching one. He tried the experiment 10 different ways, with it taking 20 minutes to set up each time. After still seeing a blurred figure or his hand show up for the 10th time, James blurted out, "Damn it! If I could just get faster or reduce the number of frames per second." James's doorbell rung, interrupting his train of thought. Looking up to a security monitor on the far wall, he saw the face of Dr. William Katz staring into the camera. He was wearing his civilian clothes, consisting of a plaid button-up shirt, a pea coat, golf pants, and an old derby. James and William had not spoken since their argument a week earlier. Reluctantly, James went out of his office, through his bed living room, through the kitchen, and to the kitchen door. Hearing the doctor knock as well, and after fidgeting a bit, James opened the door partially. James's face appeared to the doctor through the small opening in the doorway as he answered, "What's up, Doc?" Dr. Katz, looking very curious and slightly alarmed, asked, "Are you doing all right, James? Can we talk?" James answered quickly, "Oh, I'm fine, really." The doctor's face tightened some as he rebutted, "James, we haven't spoken since we nearly hit each other, and no one else has seen you in a week." James let out a sigh, answering, "Yeah, that... Look, I'm over it, okay?" Dr. Katz became more insistent. "James, I'm concerned for your physical and mental health, and your behavior is out of character, even for you. I know you're introvert and you like to spend a lot of time alone, but no one has seen you for a week, and people are worried." James clung on to the doorknob, keeping his door open only enough to see half of his face. The doctor would try to peer through the doorway, only for James to move his head so as to block the doctor's vision. James guffawed and answered, "I think people need to learn to mind their own business." Dr. Katz objected. "James, your behavior has been erratic, and your co-workers say you don't interact with anyone outside of work conversations. We need—" James interrupted the doctor, exclaiming in a slightly hushed way, "What I need is to be alone for a while. I'm not working today, and my personal activities are none of your goddamn business. With all due respect, sir, fuck off." James closed the door, slamming it shut before the doctor could draw another breath, let alone speak. Dr. Katz remained outside and waited a moment. After a few seconds, he knocked on the door again, but there was no reply. A moment later, a loud stereo in James' room started blasting out music by the Insane Viking Dolls, a heavy metal band starring Viking cross-dressers, committing acts of insane brutality, loud enough to drown out all outside noises. Dr. Katz looked to the nearby security camera, took out his phone, and sent James a text. It read, "If you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Dr. Katz sent the text, put away his phone, shook his head a bit, pulled his old derby-style cap out of his long pea coat, put it on his head, and sauntered away, having had a long day and just wanting to rest after all. James locked the door to his quarters and went straight back to his experiments. James tried altering the conditions of the test. He adjusted the security cameras in his simulation to record footage at half the frame rate, dropping it from 120 frames per second down to 60. He then ran the experiment again, this time getting slightly better results, but still failing. There were half as many instances of the camera catching what was happening as he sped objects around. Still, some of the cameras caught some footage of what was happening, if only for a few frames. James let out a frustrated sigh, holding onto his chin with his left hand. Staring at all the equipment, moving his blond hair out of his face, he mused out loud to himself. Still holding his chin in a deep thought, with the insane Viking doll still blasting, James uttered his thoughts out loud. Even in reboot or safe mode, all the cameras are still fast enough to catch me. That means, if I can't slow down the cameras anymore, then I need to get faster. Trouble is, how? James went to his computer, sat down, reached into the nearby mini-fridge, pulled out and opened a bzzzt energy drink, took a few big gulps, then started speed reading through many scientific journals and reports. After about 10 minutes of this, James stopped on a page. He cued the computer to print up the page, then went back and deleted all of his search history. James mused to himself, "That's it. Antichronometric particles. I could modify the formula to enhance my speed temporarily. But would it be enough?" James snatched the freshly printed files from his computer and read through them again, this time looking for any way to gain access to the materials. He read on to find out that antichronometric particles are found only in the core anti-aging injections. He would need to get a hold of some of that if he wished to modify his speed to be fast enough to dodge the camera's frame rates. James thought about it for a moment, then got an idea. James grabbed the remote to his stereo and reduced the stereo's volume. He read the doctor's text, nodding his head yes, and gave the doctor a call. After a couple of rings, Dr. Katz answered. "Hello? James?" James answered, "Yeah, it's me. Look." "Sorry," I yelled. "Can we meet?" Dr. Katz replied, "My husband has to work late tonight, so I was about to stop into La Muncher and get some dinner. Can you join me there?" James answered back right away, "Yeah, I'll be there in a few minutes." James hung up the phone without a goodbye, went to his closet, and changed into a clean version of the same shirt with the same green color. He also put on an identical pair of brown corduroys and a pair of green high-top sneakers. James left his apartment, locked the door behind him, and walked at a very human but brisk pace to the La Muncher Cafe. A few minutes later, James arrived at the outdoor dining area and right away spotted the doctor. The doctor eventually looked over to James just outside the food court, and seeing him, made a gesture waving him to come over. James waved back, signifying he saw the wave, and started to make his way through the small crowd of people outside the cafe. Plenty of people either just got out of work or were about to start another shift, so the area was quite crowded. Squeezing his way through several groups of people with a polite, "Excuse me," or "Coming through," James was able to make his way over to where the doctor was sitting down. Getting past the congregation of people around the tables, James got to the doctor's table, and being greeted with a "sit right here" gesture, sat down directly across from the doctor. Dr. Katz spoke as James sat down. "Glad you could make it, James. I'm not trying to get into your business. I just want to be sure you're okay is all." James nodded yes and responded, "I appreciate that. Just, yeah. You know, things have been crazy, and with the week off, I feel like if I don't keep busy, I'll make myself crazy. Dr. Katz spoke in a calm manner, but loud enough to be heard by James just above the murmur of the crowd. James, you've seen more death and chaos inside of the last 2 days than most will in a lifetime. It would be natural for you to have some anxiety or racing thoughts. Look, it doesn't have to be me, but I think that if you talk to someone, you might feel better and get through this time a bit easier. James nodded. Maybe I just. A female waiter arrived, waited to be noticed, and when both men saw her, she spoke. Welcome to La Muncher, gentlemen. Can I start you off with a drink? Dr. Katz responded warmly to the dark-haired young lady. I'd love a drink, but I'm afraid I should stick with some herbal tea. James interjected. Doc, you work hard all day, under insane circumstances. If anyone deserves a drink, you do. Dr. Katz sighed heavily and exclaimed softly, From the mouths of babes. Well, fuck it. I'll have one of the... Yeah, I'll have one of the Berblestein stout ales. James nodded, then addressed the waitress, who was hastily writing down the drink order without even looking at her notepad. You have bzz. The waitress replied with a smile. 22 flavors. Bizarre mango, wicked twist punch, orange you glad, plum lucky. James interrupted the waitress long enough to call out, Electric dew. James only now noticed that the young lady, on rollerblades, was constantly shifting her weight around to stay stable. He got lost in the physics as he watched her feet moving around. James's distraction was broken only by the bubbly waitress who, while still smiling and writing down the drink order, then replied warmly with excitement, Great, I'll get those out to you as soon as I can, and Stacy will take your order. James commented, Wow, I'm still amazed. Dr. Katz responded, Amazed? At what? James continued, That so many of the civilian employees decided to stay on, knowing full well that they may never get back to Earth. Dr. Katz nodded, saying, Yeah, for some, the Corps or someone in it is all they have to relate to, especially given how the world has become. Seemingly out of nowhere, the young bubbly hostess appeared with the two drinks, one being a bright yellow liquid in a 12-ounce tall glass with a straw, and the other being a very dark beer served with a 16-ounce tin mug. The two men thanked the kind hostess, who scooted away on her rollerblades, vanishing back into the chaos of the crowd. The doctor took a sip of his beer, set it down, then leaned in to speak to James more candidly. I know you used to go to Mr. Cogito for counseling. I can refer you to Mr. Black, who has recently taken Mr. Cogito's old position. I know it wouldn't be the same, but can you at least give him a chance? James answered hesitantly. I guess. I mean, he's just as qualified, right? Dr. Katz answered. He's not a licensed PSP, but he was a military chaplain with a background in Catholic clergy. He's very good at helping young people find their own answers, and I think that talking to him might do you some good. James rolled his eyes some at hearing the word Catholic, but didn't show any signs of protest and just nodded yes, saying, Okay, send me the info and I'll set up an appointment with him. Dr. Dr. Katz nodded. I've already set up an appointment for the day after tomorrow at 4 p.m. I trust you have time. James complied somewhat listlessly. Yeah, okay. Dr. Katz replied, Good. I'll prompt the system to send a reminder to your phone. While the doctor opened his phone to engage the program to send an appointment reminder, James looked down to the floor, eyeing the doctor's medical bag. He stared for a moment, trying to locate some sign of what he was looking for, but the contents were not in plain sight. James looked back up again before the doctor could get his face out of the phone. Putting in the last command and putting away the phone, Dr. Katz let out a relaxed breath. Okay, now that's out of the way. Are you hungry? Dinner's on me. James nodded with slightly pursed lips. Yeah, I could go for one of their sample platters. What about you? Dr. Katz gazed at his menu. I haven't had a good steak in a while. I'm thinking the filet mignon. No sooner than that part of the conversation had occurred, a sharp-dressed young man appeared as though out of the mist to take their orders. The young man introduced himself. Hello, my name is Stacy, and I'll be your waiter for this evening. Dr. Katz commented, somewhat confused. Oh, You're Stacy. Sorry, I was expecting. Stacy rolled his eyes slightly and spoke in a deeper, more masculine tone. Yeah, my mom died just after I was born, and my dad was about to go to jail, so he named me Stacy, thinking it would help me to grow up tough. James commented, Wow, did it work? Stacy snapped back, but in jesting tones. Well, I do work in food service, so you tell me, pal. Both James and William laughed at this, then focused on ordering their meals. James ordered the sampler platter with chicken wings, mozzarella sticks, and onion rings. The doctor ordered a medium rare steak with baked potato, green beans, and coleslaw. They had a little more conversation while they waited. Dr. Katz took another sip of his beer, then spoke to James in a steady and calm voice, punctuated by an honest empathy. James, the main reason I wanted to talk to you was to apologize. I yelled at you over my personal objections and even clenched my fist at you, and for that I apologize. I had no right to do any of that. James nodded silently. I get it. We're all being so affected by the signal on the planet. I doubt either of us really felt that way. So, for what it's worth, I'm sorry too. But it's like you said, Doc, I've seen a lot lately, and I think I just need to stay busy for a while so it doesn't drive me nuts. Dr. Katz inquired. Take some time to be alone if you need. Just make sure you have at least one talk with Mr. Black, okay? James nodded. Yeah. Dr. Katz answered. Well, fair enough then. Stacy seemed to magically materialize again, with both of their orders ready, balancing a large tray on one shoulder and a smaller tray on his opposite arm. A nearby customer tripped and nearly fell on her face. Dr. Katz reached out as she fell, accidentally kicking his medical bag toward James. The doctor caught the young woman's arm, keeping her from landing on a nearby table. Meanwhile, the waiter named Stacy managed to spin around and dodge the whole thing without a single tray or item being spilled. A few nearby people clapped and had a good chuckle at what had just transpired. Dr. Katz never noticed his back moving across the floor and landing at James's feet. Once everyone had settled down, the waiter passed the food around, refilled drinks, made sure they had gotten everything they needed, then moved on to the next table. James and Dr. Katz had a good chuckle and then went back to their food and drinks. They ate and engaged in light-hearted small talk for nearly half an hour. One meal, one dessert, and 4 beers later, Dr. Katz needed to take a restroom break, saying, Ha ha ha, that's funny, Jimmy boy. The doctor changed his tone to a hushed, almost whisper. Watch my stuff. I gotta take a leak. Dr. Katz stood up, staggered only very slightly, then started to shuffle his way toward the cafe's men's room on the other side of the food court. As Dr. Katz made his way through the crowd, James waited for him to disappear out of sight. With the doctor away, James first looked around to be sure that no one was watching. Seeing no watchers, James reached down to the bag, unzipped it, then fished around inside with one hand, looking for a refill canister of the anti-aging serum, containing the antichronometric particles needed for the next experiment. He found the canister, looked around one more time, and keeping his hands within the bag, took the cartridge out, and then fished an empty one from under his long sleeve and inserted that cartridge instead. With the cartridge under his sleeve, James closed the bag, then set it down on the table. A couple of minutes later, Dr. Katz returned to the table. James drew the doctor's attention, saying, Hey, Doc, accidentally kicked this when that girl fell. Wouldn't want to lose this. The waiter named Stacy returned again, and Dr. Katz took the opportunity to use the waiter's portable scanner to swipe his Matic pay card. The doctor clumsily scanned the card, sat down, and proceeded to sit down and chug the last tin cup of beer. Dr. Katz then reached across the table from his doctor's bag, and upon sliding it over to himself, unzipped it and went through it, moving items around in the bag. Dr. Katz looked up from the bag. I trust you, Jimmy, but can't be too careful. James held his breath as the doctor searched. Dr. Katz bellowed out, Okay, seems like everything's here. Thanks for the convo, Jimmy. I gotta go home and I gotta go to bed. James let out a breath as the doctor spun around and started to slosh his way towards the street. The doctor took several steps and spun around. Dr. Katz then bellowed out, "Oh, and Jimmy, don't forget about Mr. Black." James waved with a forced smile, shouting, "Okay, bye." James waited another minute or two for the doctor to get some distance away. Once he was sure that the doctor was out of sight, James casually stood and walked out of the food court and headed back home. He kept the cartridge of anti-aging serum under his sleeve the whole way. Once he got back home and had locked the kitchen door behind him, he took the object out from under his sleeve and put it into the cupboard above the sink behind several cans of veggies. James went to the security camera in his office and checked several angles to be sure that no one was following or watching him. Once he felt satisfied that he had not been spotted or followed, he straightaway sat down to the computer to conduct more research. James sat at his computer for several hours, trying varying combinations of elements to alter the antichronometric formula in such a way as to reverse its polarity. After staying up until a little past 3 a.m., barely leaving his chair for anything other than energy drinks and restroom trips, James finally fell asleep in his chair. The remains of a can of bzz got knocked over and fell to the floor, staining the carpet green as James fell into unconsciousness. Not long after falling asleep, James slipped into a dream. He awoke in a place like an infinite meadow, full of flowers of every color. The meadow was full of bright light. A sweet voice behind James called out, "Hey, I'm over here, silly." James turned around to see who was speaking. He saw a girl bathed in light. He could just make out her form, but couldn't identify any specifics. She waved at him with her right hand, uttering a warm, slight giggle. James continued to stare, feeling something familiar about her, but couldn't quite place her. Squinting and looking closely at her face, James moved a little closer. Suddenly, she held up a piece of paper in her left hand. She spoke as James tried to get a glimpse of her face. "I drew you a picture, but we don't have much time. You have to look at it now." Hesitantly, James reached out for the piece of paper, still unable to see the girl in the light. He took the piece of paper as she let go of it. Looking down, James saw a pattern something like a fractal snowflake. As he gazed into the pattern, it became numbers and symbols. The longer he stared, the deeper the hole went. James spiraled down the void, taking in innumerable symbols. He felt as though he were falling into a hole of symbols and ideas. Just as he felt totally overwhelmed, and as though he were falling into infinity, there was an even brighter flash of light. Shielding his face from the light, James looked up from the page to see the girl, retreating from the light. James saw the pale, one-eyed, dead face of Emily Weiser. James became very frightened, but held onto the paper and didn't look away from her face. The visage of Emily spoke to James, slowly becoming more skeletal with each word. "Remember my drawing. You can't forget." By the time the visage of Emily uttered the second sentence, she had become entirely skeletal. The now vicious-looking skeleton with 3 eyes growled, "Remember!" July 23rd, 1550 hours. James awoke on the floor, gasping for air. Taking in a few deep breaths, he noticed drool running down the left side of his face. Lying on his stomach, he pushed himself up out of his own puddle of saliva and spilled energy drink. Looking up, James saw that a day and a half had elapsed, and he needed to be at his appointment with Mr. Black in 10 minutes. James muttered, standing up shakily, "Aw, fuck, what the hell?" James staggered over to the fridge, grabbed a can of Mountain Shatter, opened it up, and guzzled the entire 16 ounces in just a few seconds. Wiping his mouth, he let out a very loud burp, then slammed the can down onto the counter. He grabbed his keys and wallet off the counter, stepped in front of the mirror sheen of the fridge, briskly swept his fingers across his hair to straighten it out, leaving it about half the mess as it started as, then went out to the door to make his appointment. He locked the door and started to sprint at an ordinary human pace, making his way to the counselor's offices. James slowed to a jog as he arrived in the parking lot 8 minutes later. He stopped next to a pole, caught his breath, and wiped his sweaty forehead using his left sleeve. Wiping the sleepy crust from his eyes, he walked into the building, spoke to the lady receptionist, and verified his attendance. He took a seat in the waiting room, trying to make sense of how he fell asleep for a day and a half. Just a few minutes later, another lady worker came out saying, "Mr. Battalion, Mr. Black will see you now." The young lady named Pam smiled and gestured to the double doors leading down a hallway. Pam directed James, saying, "Office number 8, last on the right." James heard, "It's never too late for her last rites." James blurted out, "What?" Pam repeated herself. "Room 8, sir, last on the right." "Right, 8," James responded, still hearing "It's never too late for her last rites" resonating inside his head. He turned his attention to the hallway as Pam stood smiling and held open one of the double doors. For a split second, James saw a second face inside hers, but did his best to not reveal how freaked out he was feeling. Laughing nervously, James smiled as he walked down the hall, seeing some sort of wiggling tracers in the fluorescent lights hanging overhead. James went to the end of the hall and stopped in front of door number 8. Seeing the 8 on the door put James into a mini flashback, whereupon he remembered some details of whatever experience had transpired after he fell asleep. The 8 had spun slightly off kilter onto its side and looked like a similar version of a symbol he saw in the strange, tunneling piece of paper from his experience. He got lost in thought, remembering pieces and fragments of the dreamlike experience. James curled up his hand into a fist to knock on the door, just then realizing that the tips of his fingers were very sore. Again, he had no idea why, but proceeded to knock on the door. A moment later, the door opened slowly, revealing Mr. Jonas Black. Jonas spoke softly with a slight rasp. "You okay, son?" James stammered and scrambled for an answer. Yeah, I'm okay. Just a little tired." Jonas held his arm out, making the "come on in" gesture. James walked into the room, first noticing the clock on the wall just hitting 1600. To the left of the room was Jonas's desk, decorated with heavy metal bobble-headed action figures. A single bonsai tree adorned the desk's closest corner. On the other side of the room were a small couch, about big enough for 3, and a pair of single chairs, as well as a beanbag chair. Jonas spoke in the same even tone. "Lay, sit, or stand, so long as you're comfortable." Jonas closed the door as James looked about and chose a single chair to sit in. Jonas walked over to the water cooler on the opposite wall, filled a cup about halfway, brought it to the plant on the desk, then slowly dumped the contents into the soil around the plant. Jonas tossed the plastic cup into the nearby waste can and sat down into his old leather office chair. Jonas had a folder open in front of him and read it for just a moment, then looked up and spoke to James. "So, it is James. Or do you prefer Jim? Or Jimmy?" James answered almost exacerbatedly, James is fine." Jonas nodded slightly. "Okay, James it is. Firstly, my condolences on the loss of Mr. Cogito. I don't know how well you knew him beyond being your previous counselor. A good guy." James answered, yawning slightly. "Yeah, Mr. Cogito was fun." Jonas added, "Well, I can't promise to be fun, but I'll try to be as helpful as I can." James stared back at the desk for a moment, noticing the bobblehead figures. They are all from bands he knew and liked: Insane Viking Dolls, Rejected Angels, Afterbirth, The Screaming Wedgies, Heartbroke Bastards, Tainted Angels, Stoned Buddha, and others. At first, James suspected that the figures may have been placed there intentionally to garner a sense of familiarity and trust, but as he looked up to Jonas's face, he started to recognize it, even through his bleary eyes. James struggled for a thought for a moment, and it occurred to him. James gasped, "Wait! You're the Jonas Black! From the Heartbroke Bastards? For real?" Jonas nodded in the affirmative. "That was a long time ago, but, yep." James wondered at the whole thing, saying, "Wow, it never occurred to me." Jonas spoke, getting to the point in a very roundabout kind of way. Yeah, Matic recruited me back in '84. I normally peddle military secrets, but seeing as how we're just out in space now, I'm falling back on other skill sets. My purpose for being here today is to find out how you're doing and see what we can do with what we've got. I intend to just get some basic information from you today, and if necessary, work with you on a treatment plan. Is that okay with you? James yawned one more time. Yeah, of course. Jonas became more inquisitive. You seem very tired. Are you getting enough sleep? James answered with a slight laugh. Yeah, more like too much sleep. I woke up just 10 minutes before coming here. Jonas listened, making intermittent eye contact, then posed his next question. Is there anything particular that's been bothering you lately? James was looking down at the carpet in the midst of another yawn and gave his reply. Nah, not really, aside from a bit of boredom. James folded his hands. Sorry. Jonas folded his hands together. Boredom. Some think of that as the hatred of what is. James looked up, asking somewhat sheepishly, Huh? What's that mean? Jonas continued, When you're bored, you're alone with your thoughts. Are there thoughts that are disturbing you? James shook his head no very slightly and answered, I just don't like not being busy. I feel like I should be doing something. Jonas replied, According to the general, you protested rather vehemently after being told that it was too late to save Emily Weiser. Could it be that you're still struggling with that? James nodded with almost a guffaw. You know, I just never saw a dead girl before. Jonas added, I would imagine that would be scary, or maybe creepy? James answered back, No, she was pretty. I was just sad that I could never get to know her. Jonas commented, That would seem very painful, but quite normal. James added, I was more angry than sad. How could someone do all those terrible things to a girl they don't know and never even met? Jonas added in a softer voice, It's hard to know what motivations and perceptions might live inside another person's mind. But let me ask you, whether the person doing this were entirely misguided and meant some greater good, or if their actions were simply heartless and mean, would either scenario help you get through the grief any better? James thought about it for a moment, then answered somewhat ponderously. Well, I guess if the people doing it were just really messed up themselves, that might make it easier to forgive. But if they were just selfish and mean, that just makes it even more meaningless. Jonas nodded while listening as James made occasional eye contact. There was a mutual silence for nearly 30 seconds, then Jonas started the conversation up again. Jonas inquired, James, have you ever done something absolutely stupid, then later on realized how stupid it was and felt absolutely terrible? James nodded in the affirmative, almost chuckling. Yeah, lots of times. Jonas continued the line of thought. Then, wouldn't it seem at least possible that the people who did this might have felt terrible themselves? James stammered some. Well, I mean, if I had a Necrosidius for a boss, I might do anything out of sheer terror. Jonas added, But we'll never really know, will we? James answered, somewhat hesitantly, No, I guess not. Jonas leaned back a bit into his chair some, reaching behind himself to a bookshelf behind his office chair. He removed a small purple book from the top shelf behind him. He turned around to face James again and set the book down onto his desk, title side up and facing James. The book cover read, Peace in My Pocket, 22 Ways to a More Peaceful Tao. Jonas chuckled. Jonas continued to speak again. Then I would estimate that, since we can't know what was in the other person's mind, maybe we should turn inward and deal with what's in our own minds. That's where we're hurting, isn't it? James answered, nodding slightly. I guess it is. Jonas' tone became a bit more stoic. There's no magical cure. It will take time and it will be very uncomfortable. Even when you think you've progressed, your mind will go back to that and hurt all over again. James guffawed. Not exactly encouraging. Jonas tilted his head slightly, looking at James directly in the eye. I never sugarcoat anything, James. If you want to get better, you'll have to work hard through your discomfort. There's no other way. Unless you become some kind of happily detached Buddha, you don't really get to choose whether you suffer or not. You do get to choose what you do with and about that suffering. You can take responsibility for it and make it better, and that will make things better. Not just for you, but a stronger you is better for everyone around you. Are you willing to try? James muttered somewhat listlessly. I guess so. Jonas became slightly confrontational. You guess so? Either you want to make your life better or you don't. Yes or no. James answered, sounding flustered. Yes, I want to make it better. Jonas' tone softened again. Good. The first thing to know, then, is that everything we feel comes from within us. You often tend to feel as though external factors are responsible, but we can't control those. But with discipline and detachment in equal measure, we can ourselves determine how we feel and react. James, I would like you to read this small book. Don't read it all at once. Read a chapter a night, then find a quiet place to just sit and be silent. Don't play any music or anything else. Be alone with your thoughts for 20 minutes. Every time a thought comes up, identify it, but don't engage it. If you get an angry thought, just say within yourself, that's anger, and then let that thought go. James inquired, and that will make my sad thoughts go away? Jonas answered very matter-of-factly, no, but it will help you to be at peace with them. James blurted out almost sarcastically, so that's it. Read some funny pamphlet and meditate? Can we just get right to the issue and fix it? Jonas answered softly but firmly, you need to juggle tennis balls before chainsaws. I expect to see you again at the same time next week. When that time comes, you will report on how your meditation is going, and we'll work on the plan some more from there. Dismissed. James nodded, stood and stretched a bit. As James' gaze fell onto the desk, Jonas gestured toward the small book with his right hand. James picked up the book, put it into his right front pants pocket. He gave a salute which Jonas returned, as per protocol. James turned to leave Jonas's office, but Jonas spoke one more time. Jonas spoke with vigor. James! James turned to listen, and Jonas continued. Keep busy if that's your coping style, but get some rest first, huh? James answered, Yes, Mr. Black. Jonas answered more softly, Okay, see you next week. James walked out of the office, gently closing the door behind him. Seeing a Matic-based transport vehicle, which for all intents is a taxi, James hailed the vehicle with a whistle and a waving hand. The driver of the core cab saw this and pulled up to the sidewalk. James got into the rear of the cab and told the driver, Housing District 8, C Street. The driver answered, somewhat deflated sounding, You got it, kid. James went silent, lost in thought during the cab ride home. As he stared out the window at various people going about their business, he thought about the conversation back at the counselor's office. He thought about all the recent events and how quickly things were changing. He thought about the fact that the city he found himself in was but an artificial environment inside a giant sphere, hurtling through space at nearly the speed of light, using solar sails sourced from reverse-engineered magitech from an alien planet. The visage of Emily's dead face kept appearing in his mind. The scenario where he caught her in mid-air and then recovered her broken-off finger played over and over again in his perception. He kept seeing Mr. Cogito, bleeding everywhere and letting out his last breath. Then the visuals and feelings from his dream experience kept playing in his mind on repeat. Every channel in his head kept all the worst, most recent, and most intense disasters playing on repeat all the time. James decided to lay back and close his eyes for the rest of the trip. The giant solar bulb at the top of the dome was almost enough to convince James that he really was riding in the back of a car on a sunny day. This reminded him of being 10 years old and riding in the back of his parents' car. That day was the day his father had a heart attack while driving, lurching the wheel to one side and veering head-on into a truck. The impact killed both parents and his older brother. That scenario played again in James's head as he remembered the impact and coming to with a broken neck, unable to move from the shoulders down, rousing him just as he was about to nod off. It felt like every thought and memory led back to some tragedy, but to be relived on repeat for the rest of his life. He eventually did fall asleep. James awoke to the sound of the car driver calling out, somewhat agitated. "Hey, kid, we're here. What number?" James sat up, wiping sleepy crust from his eyes, saying in a half yawn, Number 22. The cab driver muttered to himself, "Jesus, kids these days act like everything revolves around them." James remained silent until the car pulled up to its housing unit. Once the car stopped, he exited the rear door and turned to face the driver. Looking through the front passenger's open window, James snapped out, "Everyone I love is dead, and you can go fuck yourself." James slammed the rear door shut and stomped angrily to his housing apartment complex. After moving angrily across the lawn, James sauntered and shuffled his way up the external stairs to the fourth floor of the building. He made his way almost hobbling to the door with the sixth-floor hallway. There were halls between rooms, but all the stairs were external, with a series of stairs on each building face. Each building was octagon-shaped and had a total of 8 sets of external stairs. James unlocked the door to the hallway, went inside, and lazily shuffled down the hall to room number 6. He unlocked the door, too, and entered his apartment, fishing into his right pants pocket for a small purple book. He set the book down on his kitchen counter, then dragged his feet all the way to his office. The office was his default room to be in on account of his TV, computer, and gaming systems being in there. James sat down in front of his computer and closed his eyes for a few minutes. He went back into an unpleasant memory and was jolted awake again. He opened his eyes to see a message flashing on his computer. Out of paper. James didn't recall printing anything, so he stood up and walked over to the printer to see what the malfunction was. Upon crossing the room to the printer, James discovered that hundreds of pages had been printed out. He was mystified, having no recollection of how any of this had happened. He took another package of paper out of the plastic bin next to the printer and fed about half of the stack into the printer. James went back to the computer and prompted it to recognize that the paper had been refilled. The printer then spat out another 200 or so pages over the next several minutes. While the pages printed out, James took the time to read what had been printed and immediately recognized 2 separate phenomena. The first half of the pages were all computer code, a program of some kind. The rest of the pages were complex blueprints for building some sort of bed-like apparatus with a regenerative medicine technology built in. James's mind went wild with the possibilities. Looking over the papers, James exclaimed, "What the fuck?" Setting down the stack of papers, James again felt the pain in his fingertips and realized that it must have been from typing all those pages of code. He pondered about the possibilities, wondering any of this could revive Emily. More than anything, James was tired, so he went to the kitchen, made some sleepy night tea, put an ice cube in it to cool it, chugged it down, then went straight to bed. He laid on his stomach in his bed with his head sideways on the pillow and fell asleep almost immediately. July 26, 0333 hours. James awakened to fierce yelling and flashlights in his face. He squinted and groaned, feeling exhausted and sore everywhere. 12 security officers held James at gunpoint. A familiar voice told the officers to lower their weapons and then came faintly into view through James's blurry and overexposed eyes. He could barely make out the face of Captain Rolf Luger through the purple spots in his vision. Captain Luger spoke softly but firmly. "We got all the exits covered, kid. You coming along peacefully?" James responded, "What? What's even going on?" Captain Luger pointed to the freshly built apparatus opposite James' bed. James sat up a bit more, clearing the sleepies from his eyes. Squinting, James recognized the same device from his printed schematics. The device resembled a hospital gurney with lots of other technology attached to it. Laying in the device-laden bed was what appeared to be Emily Weiser, covered by a sheet. Behind the apparatus were also a few dozen stacks of paper, all some sort of code printed on them. James exclaimed, "What? How?" Rolf answered, "That's what we want to know. You'll have to come with us and answer some questions." James answered back, "But I don't know either. I just now woke up and there it was, same as with all the code and schematics." Rolf became more rigid. "We can figure all that out at the security station. Get your shoes on, kid. We're going downtown." One of the security officers called out, "Captain, you gotta see this." Captain Luger spoke to the nearest man. "Keep an eye on the kid." Luger then walked over to the other officer, who was leaning over the bed, taking in everything that was happening. The officer pointed to the monitor above the girl's head. Luger investigated, seeing the monitor, and asked, "Is it just me, or is that code?" The officer answered back, "Yes, sir, but where's it downloading to?" Luger looked over the whole contraption and pondered out loud. "Based on the wire configuration, her head?" James slowly turned himself sideways to get out of his bed. Nearby officer got a bit jumpy, but Luger gave him the order to stand down. Luger called out, "Stand down, he's got to get his shoes on." The officer stepped back and lowered his rifle. Meanwhile, James hobbled over to the apparatus to get a closer look. Blinking and squinting, James got a second look, confirming the body to be that of Emily. James answered, "What's she doing here?" The question went unanswered as Luger yelled over a nearby officer, "Sanchez, scanner please." Sanchez, a technically minded security officer, handed over his pocket-sized scanning device. Rolf took the device and made a slow, full scan of the body from head to toe. Rolf then handed over the scanner to Sanchez for verification. Lieutenant Sanchez nodded, speaking aloud. "Carbon, silicone, titanium, and a few things I can't even identify. And it appears to be respirating." James became more exasperated. Whoa, time out. Why is Emily here and how is she breathing?" Rolf turned around and answered unsympathetically, "I don't know what that is, but it's not Emily. Emily is a corpse in a freezer." One of the security officers was going around and discovered something in the freezer of James's mini-fridge. He held it up inside a plastic baggie, showing everyone. The officer called out, "I found it!" Inside the baggie was the finger that had broken off of Emily's body. James looked confused and somewhat terrified, seeing all this unfold. James exclaimed, falling to his knees, "What in the fuck is even happening?" Captain Luger put on his best empathy face and responded, "That's what we're all trying to figure out, kid. I've got a vehicle and a nice cushy bench seat parked outside. Let's take a ride." James stammered, "Oh, okay." Rolf followed up, "These gentlemen will escort you to the vehicle." James complied, slipped into his shoes, stood and went with a portion of the security detail. Captain Luger stayed behind with Lieutenant Sanchez and 3 of the 12 men who had entered the apartment. The other 8 escorted James to the security officers' holding cells. Back at the apartment, Luger, Sanchez, and 3 other security officers remained. Luger stared at the apparatus for several moments, trying to evaluate the potential security threats of the situation. Sanchez performed another scan of the area and brought more information to the light. Sanchez spoke. "Captain," Luger replied, "What you got?" Sanchez continued, "The signal from the Mach 337. It's being broadcast to this device here. The download is going straight into the the download is going straight into the device connected to the head, sir." Luger thought for a moment, then responded, "Shut it down." Sanchez nodded. "Right, sir." Sanchez reached out to touch the buttons on the device, but received an electric shock within a few inches of the apparatus, sending him a few feet back, almost losing his footing. Luger caught Sanchez as he stumbled backwards. "You all right, buddy?" Sanchez winced, saying, "That's smart." Luger put up a hand, gesturing Sanchez to back up some. Luger removed his energy rifle from his shoulder holster and took aim at the apparatus. Meanwhile, Sanchez was scanning the device again as Luger took aim. Sanchez rushed forward, putting Vander Luger's rifle barrel down towards the floor. Sanchez called out, I wouldn't do that, sir. Luger paused, waiting for the explanation. Sanchez completed the thought. Sir, that same electromagnetic field that jolted me just now, that would also redirect any fire aimed at it in a random direction. Luger thought for a moment, then proposed a solution. Then we shut it down at the source. A message flashed across the screen on the bed apparatus. Download complete. Installing 01%. But no one was looking at the screen. Luger dialed the extension for Colonel Shimoto and waited for an answer. Lieutenant Jack Holton was present but had not spoken the whole time. He approached Rolf and inquired, What's the plan, boss? Rolf kept the phone to his ear but looked to Jack and answered, If we can't stop the signal on this end, we gotta shut down the 337. Jack questioned Rolf, Are we sure this is the right thing to do? Rolf answered him with the phone still to his ear. We got no idea what's gonna happen if that thing activates, and that's a security risk. Jack answered doubtfully, All right, but it looks like a person to me. As Rolf waited for a response on the phone, the apparatus started to make a high-pitched whirring sound. The thousands of lines of code started to install faster and faster. Rolf turned to see what was happening with the apparatus, which had gone from 1% to 4% over the last minute. Seeing the accelerated pace of the installation, Rolf prompted Jack, Get a team down there. Shut it down manually if you got to. Jack sounded off, Yes, sir, I'm on it, and ran out of the room. Captain Luger finally got an answer on the line to Colonel Shimoto. Colonel, sorry to disturb you at this hour. We've got a security situation, and I need authorization to shut down the 337 remotely. Yes, I'll hold. Captain Luger waited for a few more minutes, pacing back and forth, occasionally glancing at the installation screen, which was now up to 32%. After a little more time, Shimoto came back on the line. Rolf listened to her for a bit, then hung up the phone and started dialing Lieutenant Holton's number. When Holton answered, Rolf gave instructions. Holton, the signal's being jammed. Shut down the 337 any way you can, even if you have to destroy it. As Rolf gave the order and hung up the phone, he stood with his back to the apparatus, watching impatiently for any word of progress. The machine powered down as the installation reached 100%, but Luger didn't notice this de-escalation, lost in all his thoughts and questions. A hand slightly touched Rolf's wrist, and a soft, raspy voice said, That won't be necessary. Startled, Luger spun around and aimed his rifle at the source of the sound. He encountered the young lady, sitting up in the bed, holding the sheet to her chest to stay covered. The young lady inquired with curious eyes, Are you going to shoot me? Rolf kept the rifle trained on the young lady, but didn't shoot, and instead asked, So, who am I talking with here? The young lady smiled slightly, then answered, They used to call me Emily. Luger's phone rung again as he answered it without lowering his rifle. He listened to Lieutenant Holton explain that the 337 had already powered down. Rolf answered and updated his security officer. Yeah, we kinda got a whole new problem. Stand by, I gotta make another call. Captain Luger dialed the general's number and waited for an answer, still keeping his rifle trained on the young lady, who continued to smile subtly and warmly. Within about 30 seconds, he got an answer. Captain Luger spoke to General Smith. Sorry to wake you, sir. We've got a maximum weird situation. I got us something that looks like Emily Weiser in James's battalion's quarters. But we also still have a corpse named Emily in Ward 13. The living one seems to be non-violent, but it's not human. Please advise. July 16th. Security Center Interrogation Room 1. 0411 hours. James sat slumped over in a metal folding chair, resting his forehead on his left palm while leaning on that same elbow. His right arm dangled listlessly beside him as he drifted in and out of consciousness under the pale blue lighting of the room. The walls to his sides and rear were constructed wholly of carbotanium, while the front wall had a carbotanium door with a wide plate of transparent titanium carbide that acted as one-way glass. A person inside the room could see their reflection, while those outside could see in. The room contained only a table, chair, sink, and toilet, in case someone was left to stew in the holding cell for some longer period of time. Dr. Katz and Captain Luger stood just outside the window to the room, looking in on James, who seemed to be completely exhausted. Dr. Katz shared the result of several tests with Security Captain Luger. The doctor stifled back a yawn as he spoke, having been awakened at such an early hour. The medical scans are both perplexing and to be somewhat expected, Captain Luger inquired. How's that? The doctor continued. Well, on the one end, the scans show a sign of physical and mental exhaustion, which would make sense if he hadn't slept in 2 or 3 days. The strange part is, his cerebral cortex shows the residue of more activity than should even be possible. Additionally, the nanites connected to his brainstem and thyroid to correct his autoimmune disorder show signs of some massive amount of energy had passed through them, to the point that the microcellular membranes around the connecting tissues show signs of extreme necrosis due to... Captain Luger interrupted the doctor. In common English. Please, doctor. Dr. Katz cleared his throat and rephrased his answer. An extreme amount of energy passed through the nanites in his brain, entering the surrounding tissue. His brain has undergone several years' worth of neurological activity in just a few days, and he most certainly has not slept in at least 2 days. Captain Luger looked through the glass at James, slumped over and falling asleep, pondering, and asked, How is something like that even possible? Dr. Katz set his clipboard down on a nearby table in the long hallway and turned to face the window as well. If it were purely a mental health diagnosis, I would say he had experienced a dissociative episode accompanied with schizophrenic delusion, but these tests throw all that into serious doubt. However, he experienced a huge surge of neurolytical energy that would have overwhelmed and most likely killed anyone else. If not for the nanites in his brain, I think we'd have a comatose patient at best. Luger nodded while listening, then added his own observation. His story still isn't making any sense. He claims to have been sleeping for 2 days and having some very intense dreams. Captain Luger picked up the styrofoam cup of coffee from a nearby table and drank the rest down, including the grounds at the bottom, making a sour face as he put it all down. Captain Luger thought for a bit, staring through the glass as James leaned face first onto the table. Well, Doc, you're the expert on broken people. How should we go about this? The doctor turned to face the captain and spoke with a calm and even tone. Whatever happened, he's quite clearly exhausted. Have a bed put in the room with him and let him rest for 8 hours. Then wake him up. Toss him an energy drink and a dozen donuts, and see if he's more conscious or compliant after that. Sergeant Jacob Bastian approached the 2 men in the hallway with a digipad. He waved to get the men's attention. Once given a hand gesture by Captain Luger to approach the 2 officers, he rushed forward with the device. Sergeant Bastian spoke with ease but professionally. Doctor, sir, I got the logs from the 337's computer, and they show a signal sent right to the young man's quarters. Captain Luger inquired. A signal? Who sent it? Sergeant Bastian lowered his gaze some, scratching the back of his head, and gave his answer. That's the funny thing. Nobody logged in. The computer just did it on its own, or somehow tampered with from outside. Thing is, further scans reveal nothing of the sort. Captain Luger answered. Well, that makes zero goddamn sense. Are you positive? Sergeant Bastian responded. Yes, sir. I was meticulous with my research. Captain Luger nodded a bit and said, Okie dokie, leave the digipad with me. Sergeant Bastard handed over the device and stepped back, awaiting further instructions. The security captain looked through the text for several minutes, then looked up again to the sergeant. Captain Luger called out, That'll be all. Dismissed. The 2 exchanged the obligatory salute, and Sergeant Bastian about-faced, though left the same way he had come in. Security Captain Luger then turned to face the doctor and gave instructions. All right, get the kid to bed, pillow and blanket. Let him get some rest and we can meet up again at 1300 hours. Dr. Katz nodded. Sounds like a prudent plan. See you then. The 2 men exchanged nods and then went their separate ways to attend to other matters. Oh, 347 hours, just outside James Battalion's quarters. General Michael Smith was greeted with a call for "Attention!" and salutes as he came within view of the security forces outside the door to James's apartment. He walked down the hallway briskly, carrying a small stack of clothing, including a female size 4 Amatic uniform, undergarments, and a pair of black shoes. General Smith returned their salute as he approached, then stopped to question them. Any further developments? Lieutenant Holton was in charge of the guards and responded, "No, sir. The girl seems friendly and compliant." General Smith nodded, then went straight through the door to the apartment and stopped in the kitchen, getting the attention of the two guards on either side of the room, who kept watch over the mysterious young girl in the room. The girl was still sitting on the bed, knees up and close together, arms wrapped around her knees, all wrapped up in a sheet with a generally contented facial expression. Mikhail acknowledged the two men with a nod and walked further into the apartment. He stopped at the doorway to the bedroom. Looking across the room, he made eye contact. He kept his posture non-threatening and walked over to James's bed opposite the gurney apparatus, keeping his chest facing in the direction of the girl. He stood at the foot of James's bed, holding the clothes in a neat pile, and spoke to the girl. "I brought you some clothes. I had to take guesses as to your dimensions and translate them to girl sizes, so I hope these are comfortable for you. I'll..." Mikhail stooped slightly, setting the clothes onto the edge of the bed. Mikhail finished the sentence as he set down the pile of clothing. "Just set these here. After you put on some clothing, it might be nice to have a conversation with you. I'll be back in 5 minutes or so. Okay?" The young girl answered calmly, still looking content. "Thank you." Mikhail backed out of the room, about-faced in the kitchen, and faced the two guards. He stared at the two guards for a moment, but neither moved. Mikhail spoke to them in a critical and questioning tone. "Do you boys intend to stay here and watch a teenage girl change?" The two men sounded off. "No, sir." The two guards hastily made their way out of the kitchen and left the apartment. Mikhail followed behind them at his own pace, got through the doorway, reached back, grabbed the doorknob, and gently closed the door. He pulled out his phone, checked the time, then spoke to one of the guards. Mikhail gave orders to Corporal Finnegan. "Finnegan, go down a mess. Put together 2 platters of all kinds of food. Grab 2 bottles of water and bring them here." Finnegan sounded off, "Sir," and sprung into action. General Smith went to the coffee machine at the end of the hallway, pressed a few buttons, then waited for the cup to drop and be filled with his coffee prepared his way, strong and black. Once the cup filled up, the general reached out, picked it up, blew on it some, and took a tentative sip from the scalding black liquid inside the paper cup. Having burned his lips and tongue slightly, and with a wincing expression, with one eye partially closed, General Smith exclaimed, "Ah, the elixir of the gods!" The general looked down to his old-style wristwatch and took note of the time. He waited patiently in the hallway, leaning up against the coffee machine. Counting the seconds in his head, he occasionally took a careful sip of his coffee, and then would check the time on his watch. Once 5 minutes had elapsed, he poured the remaining half a cup of coffee down the drain in the nearby water fountain. He made his way down the hall to room 6, whereupon the young man was just returning with the 2 platters of food and bottled water on a rectangular tray. The general took the tray and gestured for a nearby officer to open the door to the apartment. The officer complied as Mikhail stepped inside and gently closed the door behind himself using his left foot. A security officer outside protested the general going in by himself, but quickly found himself answered by the door closing between himself and the general. Mikhail glanced across the apartment, seeing the young lady sitting on the edge of James's bed, wearing the provided clothing. She looked up, smiling softly, as Mikhail's gaze met hers. Mikhail set the tray down on the kitchen table, and then gestured towards it, saying, "I've ordered us some breakfast. Would you join me in a meal and conversation?" The young lady watched the gesture and answered softly, "Yes, I would be delighted to do so." She stood up from the edge of the bed and walked casually towards the table. She paused upon seeing the setup, looked at the chair opposite Mikhail, waited, and then gently cleared her throat, waiting for Mikhail. Mikhail understood the cue and reacted, saying, Of course." Mikhail went over to the chair, pulled it out from the table, and gestured for the young lady to sit. Upon Mikhail doing so, the young lady sat down, slightly lifting herself up so that Mikhail could push the chair in some. Mikhail circled around and sat in the chair opposite her. The young lady took a napkin from the holder on the table and tucked it into the collar of her black blouse, making the napkin into a bib. The young lady spoke politely, saying, "Thank you for the meal and the invitation." Mikhail answered, "You're quite welcome, Miss—" The young lady sensed the question and answered, "I haven't yet been designated a name, but those who knew me before called me Emily."